Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us live today. My name is Shavi. I am a product manager at LinkedIn. Today with me, we have a very special and popular guest, Sachin Rekhi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here today.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us live. I know we took 2 weeks of summer break and welcome back to another episode of the LinkedIn Learning's PM Learning Series, live streaming events where we interview industry thought leaders and product practitioners about their PM career journey to inspire aspiring and current PMs like you to level up your career. So make sure you subscribe to our newsletter to receive event recaps as well as future event updates. So for those who are joining us live today, please drop in the chat where you are joining us from. Also, we're getting a number of spammy comments given how popular these events are, and our team is actively resolving blocking those spams. Make sure you don't click on the hashtags or any links. But yes, please introduce yourself, where you're joining us from, and what you're hoping to learn from Sachin today. So Sachin is one of my favorite product leaders and writers and doing so many things. Right, Sachin, you were founder and CEO of NoJoy, a fast and focused note taking app. But prior to that, you were the head of product for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and it was really impressive that you were able to take an idea to grow it into 200 million revenue in just 1.5 years, and from 0 to 500 employees. So today we'll spend a big chunk of our session learning more about how you were able to do so much, how you were able to build Sales Navigator so fast, so successfully, so quickly, and as well as how you, built NoJoy. So for people who have questions, please make sure you drop in the chat. And we have a very international crowd today. We have folks joining us from India, Connecticut, New Delhi, Chicago, Vancouver, Nigeria. So welcome to the show. And someone's probably joining from Korea, seeing some Korean characters there. Someone from London and UK, France. All right, Sachin, your fan is global. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to be here. Excited to see all the people joining us as well.
Awesome. Cool. So before we get started, I think it would just be really great to hear from you some of the basics about your career journey, how you get into the world of product.
Yeah, my story is interesting. So I fell in love with my first computer that I got in middle school. My uncle actually gave me his Apple IIc because he was upgrading to an IBM PC, and I just fell in love with this thing. And like every kid, what I fell in love with was games. This thing had Carmen Sandiego. It had this other game called Lemonade Stand, and I just love these things. I'd play them all day long. And then one day I asked my parents, like, hey, I'm kind of bored of these games. Can I go buy some new games? And they're like, no, we don't want you rotting your brain with like more video games. And so I had to like figure out, what do I do? And I'm like, well, maybe I can make my own games. And then I discovered on this computer, there's this thing called Apple Basic. And I taught myself Apple Basic to code up my own games. And so then I made these games that my friends would play that would be these like text-based adventures where it'd be like, do you want to go left or right in the dungeon? You can go left. And it'd be like, you were stabbed by a dagger. And I fell in love with this whole idea. And eventually I learned QBasic and then Visual Basic. And then I remember one day distinctively, my uncle told me that, hey, you seem to like computers. Maybe you want to be a software engineer. And my mind was blown that I could get paid to write code, and that was even a thing, like a profession. And I was hooked. And I knew, like, even then in middle school, that software engineering is what I wanted to do. And so I started reading up on it. And I grew up in a small town, didn't know anything about Silicon Valley and whatnot, but I read about this guy, Bill Gates, who created this great startup called Microsoft. And I heard that he not only wrote the software, but he actually was the first sales guy that sold what they built to IBM. And so I'm like, okay, I guess if I want to do this as a job, I have to learn both how to write software, but also how to sell software. And so when I went to college, I decided to study both computer science and business at Wharton. And so that was sort of what got me into kind of what I thought I wanted to do with my life. And then I remember when I was at Penn, I was interviewing at Microsoft, the company I was so excited about. And the recruiter was like, hey, I know you applied for a software engineering role, but have you ever heard about this thing called product management? And I actually hadn't at the time. And she was starting to tell me about it. She's like, you don't actually write the code, but you actually get to come up with the requirements, design the features. And I'm like, I'll give it a try. Why not? And I did it as a summer internship, absolutely fell in love with it. And kind of the rest is history. I ended up sort of stumbling upon product, but then it became my life's calling.
Yeah, I love that story. I like how you kind of get to learn about it through your passion playing games, and then you kind of the best way to learn is, through interest and like learning by doing. You learn more about software engineering, you learn more about writing codes, you learn about Bill Gates, and then eventually working for his company. I love that story. You're one of those luckier people, right, that get into product early in their career. So I'm sure a lot of folks joining us today globally from all around the world are interested in breaking into product. And, it's a very popular job nowadays, not just in Silicon Valley, but globally. So what would you say are your advice to, say, early career professionals with a year or 2 years of work experience trying to break into PM? And then how does that advice differ, let's say, for someone who's a mid-career professionals who might have maybe 5 to 10 years of work experience in a particular field? How should they think about getting their first PM job? Should everybody become a PM?
It's a great question. I think that, I had a fairly, I'd say, traditional path into product. Computer science undergrad, applied to a large tech company that had these sort of like associate product manager roles that are targeted at first-time product managers. And so that's a very traditional path. A very similar traditional path is maybe you did engineering undergrad, you go back to get your MBA, and now you're again applying to these organizations that usually take on new PMs with MBAs. And so those are the most traditional paths. And so I think I encourage people that are in college, just graduate from college, like those ends up being the paths that are most helpful. Now, the important thing is, what about the rest of us that have already graduated, that are already in our careers and now have discovered product is something that they might want to do? Now, what I've found in that case is there's really two paths that I advocate as the most common paths to making such a later stage career transition actually work. I call them the adjacent role and then the domain expert. So let's talk about each of these in turn. The first one is the adjacent role. The idea with the adjacent role is you want to join a company where you get a chance to work with the product team in an adjacent role for which you have the skills today, and then parlay that into an opportunity at that company to ultimately try to get more product experience and then hopefully to transition into the product role. And so let me make this concrete because I've seen this happen a dozen times. When I was at LinkedIn, I worked with people on the business operations team that actually worked closely with us on the product team, provided a lot of value, and made it clear, ultimately they hope to become a product manager one day. And so I gave them opportunities to work with me on product related work, and then ultimately was able to sponsor them to move into a product role. Now, I've seen this happen not only with business operations, but I've seen this happening with product marketers who are interested in moving to product. I've seen this happen with designers that are interested in moving to product. I've even seen sales and sales operations folks move into product in a similar fashion. And so the idea here is find the role that you are skilled at today, and then find a way to work with the product team and then leverage that opportunity at that existing company where they can see that you're a rock star. They see that you're incredible at the work that you're doing. They see you have passion and interest in product, and then parlaying that into an actual product role. So that's the first way that I think is sort of a very common path. Now, the second way is what I call the domain expert. And so the idea here is that you personally has some kind of domain expertise that's highly relevant to the company that you're looking to be a PM for. And then they're bringing you on as a PM because of that unique skill set you have in terms of domain expertise. So let me give you 3 quick examples of this. I know a guy that was in sales operations. And they basically ended up joining a sales tech startup as a PM because they were so good at the craft of sales operations. And here's this company building tools for sales operations and sales teams. Now, a similar one is I know a person who basically got a master's in education and then ended up becoming a PM at an ed tech company and leveraging all that experience she had in education to go get that role. Or I know an MD who ended up becoming a PM actually in a more medically oriented startup. And so they're leveraging their domain expertise to be the thing that gets the foot in the door, even though they lack the actual functional skills of being a great PM. And so I'd really encourage people to think about those paths as what could they make work for them in their own career story to ultimately make that transition.
Absolutely. Case in point, I was working in a adjacent role in sales productivity, managing tools, and eventually transitioned into product. I think your advice really resonated with the LinkedIn community. Liz said, and a few others. Cynthia said, great advice. Some LinkedIn users are already doing what you're recommending, right? Leading product design and hoping to one day transition into product. So adjacent role as well as domain expertise. I think those are great advice. Now, let's transition and talking about your experience building LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So at the beginning, in my intro and in the event description, we mentioned that you were able to rapidly scale the business from ideation to $200 millions in sales in just 1.5 years. Can you tell us a little bit about just how were you able to grow the business so quickly? And then I think specifically for some folks, especially folks working at big tech company, how did you find opportunities to work on like 0 to 1 product? What was that process like?
Yeah, so it's a pretty unique story. So the way I got to LinkedIn is I started a company called Connected, which was a contact management tool that automated contact management. So you wouldn't have to keep your contacts up to date. It would do it for you. And it really acted as sort of a personal CRM to help you maintain your relationships. And so ultimately, Connected was actually acquired by LinkedIn. And when we were building Connected, it was actually a paid product. So you'd spend $10 a month to get access to this. And so all of our top users were sales professionals because they were in the business of relationships and therefore willing to pay for a tool like ours. When we got acquired, what we decided was the relationship management tools would be appropriate for all of LinkedIn's general professionals. And so we actually decided to make it completely free, bring the kind of functionality that we had into LinkedIn in the contact section. And so we really then focused on the general professional. But I remember early on after joining LinkedIn, I went to talk to David Hahn, who was running monetization products at LinkedIn. And I told him, hey, look, we had a lot of success with sales professionals. I think LinkedIn has a huge opportunity to go after sales professionals in a deep way. And I just wanted to offer that feedback based on the experience I had working on Connected. And it didn't make sense for me to work on that right now because we were working on bringing our functionality to the general professional. But I remember a couple of years into LinkedIn, David Hahn came to me and said, hey, you've done a fantastic job incorporating this functionality for the general professional. And, would you be interested in now doing what you mentioned, which was building something specifically for sales professionals? We agree there's an opportunity to go after them in a big way. We just don't know what that opportunity is. Do you want to try your hand at figuring that out? Now, what's key about this story is that I proved myself in sort of the existing consumer division, building product, showing success on that product, having some wins, both in terms of delivering the product quickly, great early traction in that product. And I was able to basically parlay that, which created my internal credibility in the organization, to go work then on a bigger bet, a riskier bet. That was something completely brand new in the organization. And I think that's important, that it's important to realize that you need to build credibility and social capital to have the chance, the permission to take on these career opportunities. And I encourage people to think about it that way. Of course, you should make your team and your managers aware where you want to go, but you also need to find ways to create the credibility on why you're the person to go do that. And I remember David even saying, hey, Sachin, I know you don't have sort of the typical general manager background. that we typically look for when you're running something like LinkedIn Recruiter or whatnot. But what we really need is this product innovator background, because we're building something from scratch versus managing an existing business. And that was the experience I brought to bear to enable me to really take a shot on building a new product for sales professionals.
Yeah, I love that story. I love how you demonstrate that you preceded an idea thinking long term, right? Not just like near term trying to get that big job, but you preceded the idea. Then you build up your social capital through consistently delivering results, getting momentum, getting traction, getting that buy-in, which in a bit we will talk about how you kind of build that. I like to maybe double click on how you define strategy for sales nav. Like you mentioned, it's a big shoes to fill. It's an innovator hat, different from, trying to scale a mature business. You're really defining something that's not really exists in the market yet. You're not sure what opportunity to work on. So can you walk us through how you define product strategy, especially in a ambiguous, I guess, set context, and any framework or any systems that you can share process that would benefit our listeners today?
Yeah, it turns out product strategy is incredibly important when you're working on a 0 to 1 product, a brand new product. Everything is sort of a moving part. Who's the target customer going after? What's the problem we're solving? What's our value prop? And we need to get that to coalesce into a compelling product strategy. And so I had learned through a variety of startup endeavors. Connected was actually my second startup. How to think about product strategy for a new startup. And I applied that same framework to actually what I did for Sales Navigator. So I wanted to bring up a slide where I talk about the 6 dimensions of product strategy on the next slide here. So what I think is really important is that any product, when it thinks about its product strategy, needs to be able to answer these 6 questions and be able to have a compelling argument for each of these 6. And so I think where people struggle is they usually have a piece of this. They figured out maybe 1 dimension or 2 dimensions. But in order for it to be compelling, you have to touch on all 6 in your product strategy. So I want to just talk for a brief second about each of these so you get a flavor of what I mean by this. First, you want to be extremely concrete about what is the problem you're solving. What's the acute pain point that your product addresses? And it's important to separate that from the solution. Too often people describe their problem in terms of the solution, but you want to be clear on what's actually the pain that people are experiencing. The second is the target audience. Who is the best fit customer segment you're going after? And here you want to be as specific as possible. And so to illustrate with Sales Navigator, this wasn't for sales professionals. We got this down to, this is for B2B sales professionals in tech and financial services industries, specifically in account executive roles that are selling products that are worth 10 to 100K ACVs. That is an incredibly specific definition of target audience. And I think where people go wrong here is they keep that definition very high level and large, but you're going to have more success the more specific you can be. Now, you also have the value proposition, which is what exactly is your solution? How are you going to solve the problem? And you want to make sure you're doing this not in terms of features, but in terms of the actual benefits to the end user. You also want to figure out what's your competitive advantage. Why are you able to do this successfully against better than the competitors, both in the near term and the long term? You're going to have to figure out your growth strategy. How are we actually going to get customers for this product? And finally, we're going to have to figure out a business model. How are we going to do this profitably? And so the next slide, I get at like, how do we actually make this compelling? It's actually pretty easy to write something down for these 6 dimensions, but that alone doesn't make it a compelling strategy. We instead need to focus on the interplay between the dimensions to make it compelling. For example, does the problem you're solving resonate strongest with your target audience? You want to make sure that the problem is most acute for the very specific target audience that you picked. Or for example, does your value proposition adequately solve the problem? Is it really the right and most compelling solution to the problem you've laid out? And finally, does your business model enable your growth strategy? Do we have a growth strategy that works given the kind of business model we have? We talk about things like LTV to CAC and whatnot. And so the key thing here is for your product strategy to be compelling, you have to have a strong interplay between each of these dimensions. When you're working on an existing product, it's a lot easier because most of this is figured out, and you're mostly spending time figuring out how do you increase the value that you're delivering. But now you have all these dimensions to figure out. And so it's so important to do this that we started Sales Navigator with writing a narrative doc that really talked about these 6 dimensions and tried to figure out how do we make these work. And I think part of our success was we started with a competitive advantage. What did LinkedIn uniquely have that no one else had that enabled us to come up with compelling answers to each of these 6 questions? And for us, it was this up-to-date, comprehensive profile data that enabled us to leverage that for sales professionals in an interesting way. And so this is sort of the idea of like, how do you actually get really tight and coherent about your product strategy to try to come up with something really compelling.
Awesome. I love that. I just want to address a couple comments. So a lot of people ask for copy of this slide. If you subscribe to our newsletter, we'll share the link to the slide in the newsletter recap article that we sent out on Wednesday. And Sachin will include additional links to further elaborate some of this concept. So folks, don't worry about it. Also, I think your point earlier, Sachin, really resonate with a lot of our LinkedIn members about building credibility and social capital before you can then tap on, impactful, innovative opportunities, how you really leverage your experience in startups and bring that to generate value for LinkedIn. Now, I wanted to maybe double click on the last point that you mentioned about business model needs to enable your growth strategy. Can you elaborate a little bit more what that entails?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is like probably the most important dimension where you need to have these tied very closely together. And so what I mean by that is certain growth strategies are only possible or enabled by specific business models. And so let's talk specifically about some examples here. Let's say you're going to do a paid advertising approach to driving growth for your product. So you might use Google search ads or Facebook ads or Instagram ads, and you're planning on using that as a channel to grow your product. Now, that only works if the revenue that you're generating on a per user basis is large enough to justify that spend. So some people talk about this as sort of CAC to LTV ratios, LTV being the lifetime value of the customer and CAC being the cost of acquiring that customer. You have to have a greater lifetime value in order to be able to afford to acquire that customer through things like paid advertising. And so you need to be thinking about this, right? So you need to figure out what is actually enabled by it. Or for example, if you're planning on using direct sales, this idea of selling your product with a direct sales team, your product has to be expensive enough to be able to support having a direct sales team. If you're not charging, say, like 100K annually for your product, it's actually very difficult to actually have direct salespeople to actually go sell that product for you. And so now you need to think about what kind of revenue model can you actually enable for your product, and that constrains the amount of growth channels that you can use. And it's that relationship between the two that's really important to understand to come up with an actual compelling strategy here.
Awesome. So I think defining compelling strategy is one thing. Getting the team to buy in and agree and willing to commit to execute on that strategy is another thing. So, Sachin, what are some of the frameworks or process that you use to get buy-in, influence without authority?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the story of Sales Navigators is applicable here. What was interesting is when David Hunt first asked me to take on the role, we ultimately decided this was going to be what LinkedIn called a venture initiative, meaning this isn't like part of our core product, but we're innovating on a new product area. And so the idea was, hey, Sachin, you're going to have a team of 8 to 10 engineers in a corner with you, trying to figure something out. If it works, great. If it doesn't, hey, we'll chalk it up as, this is what innovation is. And that was initially the idea around the product. Now, I got the opportunity to present Sales Navigator at this interesting offsite that LinkedIn ran called Project X. And at the time, it was, how is LinkedIn going to grow to 10 billion in revenue, which was a total pipe dream at the time. And a bunch of people were presenting, and I was asked to present all the stuff we were working on with Sales Navigator. a lot of people that were presenting were coming in and showing TAM-based analyses of opportunities that LinkedIn could go after. But I was in the middle of doing product research. And so I came in with a very different kind of presentation. I said, hey, look, we've been ideating on this product. Here's all the screenshots of the product that we built. And here is verbatim quotes from potential customers on their feedback on what they've seen so far. We had Apple's sales team being like, I wish we had this product yesterday. We had JP Morgan sales team saying, I see how this would be my daily homepage instead of Salesforce. And so what was fascinating about it is we had gotten so deep into the product discovery process that we had very detailed conversations from customers on what they were excited about. And what was fascinating is that after that presentation, the leadership team at LinkedIn came back and said, hey, Sachin, we're basically upgrading this to a strategic initiative, meaning we're going to blow up the size of your team. This is going to become something that you launch whenever you get around to it, to now being like, we need this product to launch in the next year because we really are betting on this as the next bastion of growth. And what was compelling about it was the fact that we leveraged a very specific technique here to try to convey the value of the product. And it was social proof in this case, that we had specific people like Apple, JP Morgan, SAP, saying what was compelling about the very detailed instantiation of the product. And that's what ended up being more compelling than sort of the more traditional business opportunity analysis. And so that was one way that we ended up being compelling about it. Now, the reason this is important is you got to really think about this idea of how do you convince the stakeholders that you want to convince. And so you'll see in the next slide here, the idea here is that we want to be thinking about the substance and the style of the argument that we're making. We always typically think about the substance, which is what's the argument I'm making, but we also got to be thinking about how we're going to convince people, and that's that style element. So in the next slide, I talk about the 6 types of style that I think are really important. I already talked about social proof, which is the one that we used, but there's different ways that you can think about making your argument compelling depending on the stakeholders you're trying to convince. Another one is framing. How do you actually tell the narrative in a way that you're basically setting people's context and driving them to the desired conclusion? Or another one is goal seek, this idea that how do we actually redefine the initiative in terms of the decision maker's own goals? Maybe there's a key priority for the CEO or your boss, and you can then come up with how your initiative specifically solves for their goal. Another one that's common is citation, which is like how to use data in all shapes and forms, whether it's A/B testing results, analytics, voice of customer, to make a convincing argument. And finally, things like narration, like how do you retell your argument as a compelling story? And so what's really important here is figuring out which style is going to be most appropriate for the stakeholder you're trying to convince. And changing your style based on that. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the substance of our argument, but not enough time thinking about this, the style in which we're going to make that argument. And you want to be thinking about this as you're preparing those key presentations to key stakeholders like leadership and whatnot, and being very thoughtful about it in the process.
I love this because I believe a lot of times, probably 80% of the time, we spend on thinking about a substance, right? Like what we build, how do we communicate that it's the right solution, solving the right problem. But the style, who you talking to, flexing your style, maybe even within the same company, different VPs or stakeholders might have different preferences, right? I think social proof, like that you mentioned, getting big names, showing interest in your product is a great way to basically like show that someone else have already got the buy-in to like execute on this idea. I think that's genius. So I think we always learn so much from you, Sachin, and we're going to move on to actually the third part of this talk, which is around your entrepreneurial journey, how you founded NoJoy, right? So you left LinkedIn a couple years ago and started working on your own startup. Tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea. I think there are some question in the chat also asking about, how did you start this product discovery process? And then like knowing that NoJoy is the right product to build?
Yeah, so great question. I think what's fascinating is the idea for No Joy came when I was actually running LinkedIn Sales Navigator. And what was fascinating is LinkedIn Sales Navigator quickly grew to the strategic initiative within the organization. And as I mentioned, the team eventually grew to 500 people with 400 people in direct sales, and then 50 people in R&D and 50 people in marketing. And I ultimately found myself as the co-GM of this business. And so I moved from worrying about sort of the individual specs and things to having a team of PMs as well as a broader team that I needed to shepherd to ultimately building the right product. And so I was spending all my time thinking about how do I make sure all these people are effective and these people are all moving in the right direction and having the information they need to be successful. And what was fascinating is I talked to people and they'd be like, I don't think I have all the information I need to be successful. I think there's things going on in this organization that I don't know about. And this is despite using all the modern tools, whether it's Google Docs, Confluence for wikis, we were using email and we had Slack, and we all still felt like we didn't have the information we needed. And so as we dug into this, I started to realize that, it's fascinating. 90% of institutional knowledge within the organization never made it to a Docker wiki. It was actually stuck in email, in Slack, in people's heads, in word of mouth conversations, in whiteboards. And the small subset that made it to a Docker wiki only represented a very small subset of the content. And this was why people felt like they couldn't find the structured content they needed to be successful, because it was stuck in someone's email or in someone's head. And so we thought a lot about how could we solve this gap of trying to get more content into a structured way. And what we noticed was a lot of people were sitting in meetings actually using notes apps to capture content, but that content never got shared with the rest of the organization. And so we thought, what if we could create a highly productive note-taking app that was also collaborative, that would then enable you to share more of that knowledge in a structured way relative to what you were doing today. And so that was sort of the idea of where No Joy came from. And if we just quickly bring up the last slide that I had, I think what's really interesting about it is one more, is that the best startup ideas come from what I call earned secrets, right? And this idea of earned secrets is that it's earned, meaning that you gained it from some lived experience, and that it's a secret, meaning that it's kind of contrarian and non-obvious. And so I just talked about what it was for No Joy, but the reason it was kind of contrarian and not obvious is people thought Google Docs was pretty good. They're like, hey, I can capture content in it, it's pretty good. But we felt like, because it's only capturing 10% of institutional knowledge, it's actually pretty poor if most of the knowledge never even makes it there. And so that was sort of our non-obvious secret. Take it, for example, another company, Open Door. They talk about how homes are much more like a commodity than people's intuition. People traditionally thought of them much more like fine art. And they had said, we can actually give you a price to sell your home on the spot using algorithms. And that was very controversial and contrarian at the time. And so when you're thinking about what your startup idea should be, you want to use this test. Do you have earned secrets that you can ultimately use as the basis or the germ of the idea that you'll ultimately try to convert into this product strategy that we talked about earlier?
I love how you separated them too, because they indicated two parts, right? One is earn through life experience. So you are filling the plane, like dog fooding, almost this concept, right? And then secret, which is non-obvious, and that's how you win, have a compelling value prop. We're coming a little bit short on time, but Sachin, I do like to double click on what are some of the obstacles that you face building this product? And how would you compare this experience building 0 to 1 product for your own startup for companies like LinkedIn when you were building Sales Navigator?
Yeah, so building 0 to 1 at a new startup versus an established company is quite different. A lot of the frames we talked about are still applicable on product strategy, having earned secrets, but the execution looks very different. Kind of the first biggest one is you just have far fewer resources. And so when we were building LinkedIn Sales Navigator, I had an expert UX research team that would help us develop incredibly beautiful scripts to interview customers that were unbiased and help execute that. When we wanted to do competitive analysis to understand the market that was already out there, I had a product marketing team that can go run with that and go execute on that. When we wanted to get early feedback from customers and understand how they were experiencing the product, we had the marketing research team that could actually run our NPS surveys. And so we had a lot of resources to bring to bear to really do that. Now, what happened at NoChoy? The polar opposite. If I want to talk to a customer, I'm going and talking to a customer. If I want to go pull some data to understand how people are using our product, I'm running some SQL queries. And so it's very different in terms of the available resources, especially from like a 0 to 1 startup. And so you have to be open and willing to do all of these jobs to make you successful. And so the part that's interesting about how to do that well is while I was at LinkedIn, I was very curious about how everyone did their job. I talked to our UX researcher about how are you coming up with the script. I talked to our marketing team on how they were running the NPS surveys. I talked to our designer on how they're making the choices they were making. And I tried to be a sponge of all the people I got to work with so I can sort of get some of their superpowers that when I had to go do this on my own, that I was ready and capable of doing that. And so that's number one. I'd say number two big difference is often when you're building at an existing organization, you have access to an existing audience that you can bring to bear for your product. Obviously, with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, there was tens of millions of sales professionals using the LinkedIn free product that we could then advertise this new product to. With NoChoy, we had no users, right? So we had to figure out that growth strategy from day one to incent people to come into our product. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the viral loops of how do we have someone come and use our product, invite others into the product, and share it virally, and build that and bake that into the product from day one. And so you really have to think a lot more thoughtfully about growth than you would when you're building a product at an existing company.
Definitely lack of resource, having to think about building viral groups to generate more sales without being able to tap into an existing pool of users. I think that was a great summary. Your earned secret, I think, had really resonate with people, the audience. David thinks it's a great way to get empathy around pain points. You remind someone of blue ocean strategy, right? It's non-obvious. Great points, and totally agree. So we're coming up at time. I wanted to maybe let people know how can people follow you and get in touch with your work, Sachin. What are some ways? I know that you write a newsletter with a lot of great articles. Tell us more about how can people stay in touch with you.
Yeah, so you can definitely follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. On Twitter, I'm just Sachin Rekhi. And you can also check out my blog at sachinrekhi.com. I've written over 150 essays there. I also have about a dozen videos on YouTube, all about product management as well as the entrepreneurial journey. I also recently launched a course with Reforge called Mastering Product Management, which goes through a bunch of different frameworks on how do you actually go from good to great in your product management abilities. And have a upcoming course coming in the summer. The courses are offered 3 times a year, so I encourage you to check that out as well.
That's awesome. I think your session has been really useful and resonating with a lot of our LinkedIn audience. I also like to give special shout outs to Grant, who are part of LinkedIn, but has always been helpful to respond to comments around how to access the recording for this live event. It will be replayed through the same link, and you can access to our newsletter through my profile. And thank you so much for joining us today, Sachin. We learned a lot from you. I would definitely pay more attention to the styling of the arguments that I need to make next time. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks. Bye. See you at the next PM Learning Series.